hitting the button. All right, we are now recording. So I would like to hand the floor over to Kaitlin right now for a talk about the work that she does in documentation. We've got some, after Kaitlin does a bit of a presentation, we have a few questions for discussion. And yeah, take it away, Kaitlin.
Great, thanks, Jordan. So as I said in my intro, I'm Kaitlin Newson. I'm the Digital Projects Librarian with Scholars Portal in Toronto. In my current role, I support technology services primarily for scholarly publishing and research data for Canadian university libraries. And another part of my role is that I work very closely with the Public Knowledge Project, also known as PKP, which is an organization that creates software for scholarly publishing. So a couple of years ago, a new version of their documentation interest group, which we also call the DIG or DIG, was formed, and I was approached by PKP to serve as the coordinator for this group, which I was pretty excited to do because I had been involved a little bit in some of their other documentation. So today I'd like to talk a bit about that group, about our processes, some things that work for us, and how we kind of try to stay organized and keep everybody. Sorry, lost track of my thoughts there for a second. So how we try to kind of keep everybody from feeling too burnt out as we continue this process. So our documentation group is coordinated by myself alongside Amanda Stevens at PKP. So she's kind of our lead on the PKP side of the group. And our group has virtual sprints for an hour and a half every 2 weeks where we work together on our documentation projects. So alongside those sprints, we also have monthly planning meetings where we discuss our priorities as a group for what we want to work on, any issues that have come up, and how we kind of make our decisions as a community in those meetings. So during those sprints, we're all on a Zoom call, and we talk about what we're going to work on today, and then largely we're muted a lot of the time, but then we have each other there to ask questions, or if issues come up, if people need technical support, any things like that, then we're all there to help each other out during those sprints. So the membership of the community is made up of PKP staff as well as volunteers from organizations that use PKP software. And on average, our sprints have a range of 4 to 8 people at a time. So as we were building up this group, we were really lucky and fortunate that PKP does have a strong established community of membership of people who wanted to join this group, who wanted to be involved. PKP has development partners and people that contribute to it financially as well. And there were people from those organizations who wanted to be involved in the documentation group too. We do leave the participation open to anybody to join though, and we try our best to post our sprint schedules online, although we haven't been very good lately at maintaining that, I will admit. So in order to try to kind of reduce burnout on the initiative, and I'd really love to hear too if other people have ways that they try to do this in their own working groups and committees, because it is something that I think about a lot. So we have tried to make it clear to participants that they can join any sprint at any point or any meeting at any point. They're free to miss them. I think we do keep notes from all of our meetings that are pretty clear, which I think allows people to catch up if they do need to miss things. Having co-chairs leading the group allows myself and Amanda as well to to miss meetings as needed, if other things come up or if, we have capacity changes. And another thing that we've tried to start doing recently too is to have different team members leading specific documentation projects. So to try to kind of spread out the ownership of different documents to different people. And they've volunteered to do that. Like it's not something that anybody is forced to do. Usually there might be a particular document where somebody is like, oh, I have a lot of experience with this particular part of the software or this particular workflow, and I would, like to take the lead on this particular project. So it's really helpful for, keeping track of the status of different things and spreading that out among the group. So we do also try to give participants multiple different ways to contribute. So some people are happy to participate in these bi-weekly sprints and these monthly meetings and, to be fully engaged at that level. But, this format doesn't work for everybody and not everybody has the capacity for this level of involvement either. So, we try as much as possible to communicate with people, via email, offline. If they have, documentation they want to contribute, they're free to just send us things and, we'll be happy to move it into our documentation website for them to review it as a group. So, they don't have to necessarily be involved in the full process that we have. Additionally, we also try to structure our infrastructure in such a way that opens up these contributions too. So within our documentation website, on every page of the documentation, there are little links that say edit this page. So what that will do is it will take that user into GitHub, where all of our documentation lives in the GitHub repository, and allows them to edit that page directly. And then as well, if somebody is not comfortable doing that, we do have a contact form that we link out to too, where they can send things to the documentation group. And we can move it into GitHub or fix an issue that they've pointed out directly. Because of course not everybody is comfortable using GitHub or has that experience, or may just not have the time to figure out kind of how the documentation works at that level. We do also try to, as much as possible, engage with external groups. So one of the things about PKP's software is that it does integrate with a lot of other technologies. For example, things like Google Scholar or the directory of open access journals, or different plugins that the software has that integrate with other applications. So we also try to work with people from external organizations to work on documentation. So we've worked with people at Google Scholar, at ORCID, which is another tool that integrates with OJS. So we get, we can draw from their expertise, but again, they don't have to be fully involved in the documentation group in order to make those contributions. And in some cases, this might be offline as well. We might, work on something at one of the sprints, and then we would send our documentation along to them. They would, read through it, make suggestions, and then it would come back to us and we would put it into our documentation website. So I think, too, one of the things that has really made this work well is that there's also organizational commitments to this documentation. So PKP obviously, is committing their staff resources to ensuring that, this is a priority. And there's also the partner organizations like my own who've said, this is something that we care about. We, care about the software, and we're committing, our staff's time, in some cases in, the form of a written agreement where it's been spelled out that, yes, Kaitlin, will work on this for X number of hours a week. So having that commitment means that it's clear, there's an organizational commitment, and it makes it easier for me to know, this is something that my organization supports and I have the space to work on without worrying about how it's interfering with other things on my plate. So probably unsurprisingly, something that helps a lot with our group is documenting our documentation. So we have a giant spreadsheet where we track different tasks and priorities that we have, things that we want to work on, what documentation currently exists, and who is kind of the owner of that documentation, who should I contact if I have a question about this particular document. So for example, we have a guide for system administrators, and it's not something that I personally am responsible for, but I know who to contact if I have questions about that particular documentation. And again, these aren't necessarily people that are on the documentation interest group, but people that are committed to it and have experience with these particular areas. And as well, during sprints, we would use these spreadsheets to keep track of the status of different documents, who's working on which part of a document, or if we're moving things into GitHub, who's working on different pages, things like that. So we also have a contributor guidelines that they were created even before I had joined the group. These tell people, how they can contribute, kind of explaining all the different technical aspects of the documentation, the structure, things like writing styles and preferences and standards that we have. So it's a good place for us to point people to if they have questions about how do I get started, how is this structured, things like that. So we have pretty lengthy contributor guidelines, which I can link to in the notes later as well, if people are interested. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also keep, clear meeting notes between all of our monthly meetings that people can go back and review. And then in terms of our infrastructure, so as I mentioned earlier, the documentation is all stored in GitHub. Content is all written in Markdown as well. And it's a static website that uses a technology called Jekyll to build the site, but it's not technology that our contributors necessarily need to be familiar with in any way. So participants can edit and add their content directly in GitHub's interface, and then submit a pull request to submit that change, and then myself or somebody else in the documentation group can review that change and accept it, and then it will be added into our documentation. So there is a little bit of learning that needs to happen for the documentation group's core members around how to use GitHub and some of the core parts of GitHub, like what is a pull request, how can I make a pull request, and that's something that I've made myself available to the group to teach them, how to do that if they're not familiar. And sometimes it's just having a one-on-one call, with them, demystifying some of the technology aspects as well. And part of this that's I think really key is just reducing as much as we can those technical barriers to participation. So we have a lot of different technology that's involved in our site, but we don't necessarily want everyone to have to learn every single piece in order to contribute, because otherwise people might become intimidated. They might feel like this is too much to learn, it's not worth the trouble. So we try as much as possible to reduce those barriers in whatever way that we can. So one of the first things that we found helpful as a group is at our very first documentation sprint that we had, the first thing that we did was converted an existing PDF document into Markdown. And that was a really good way for everybody to learn the basics of Markdown, how the formatting works. And then at the end of that sprint, we had a full document that was ready for our documentation hub. So I think that was really everything I wanted to say today about our processes. I just wanted to mention one last resource. So I had linked in my my intro bio before this. There's a community called Write the Docs um, that is really excellent. They have chapters in different cities, and they're a community that revolves around documentation, best practices in the area, um, infrastructure, kind of all kinds of things. They have a Slack channel as well for people who want to get involved in that group. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the documentation interest group members who I certainly have not done all of this. I can't take responsibility for all of the work that's happened here. It's a really great group. And I think Jordan's already linked to it in the chat, but there's a list of our members there that I do want to acknowledge. So that is everything from me. And thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaitlin. Before we get to our Q&A, I just wanted to highlight 2 questions in the chat. Kelsey asks if you've explored using Gitbooks for docs to get around the GitHub issue as they have an edit interface.
That is a great question. So actually PKP's documentation used to be in Gitbook, but I think that it was actually taken out of Gitbook because Gitbook started charging. So unfortunately, because of that change, I wasn't as involved in that decision, so I'm not sure of all the details, but that was my understanding. So when they started charging, and I think that there were other issues as well with Gitbook, but yeah, unfortunately, we had to move away from Gitbook.
All right. And now Thurston asks, I'm encouraging a large catalog / documentation / summary of related research project to adopt this pull request-based approach to organizing. Any tips or common pitfalls to avoid when teaching non-Git folks? Sorry, Thurston, I maybe if you want to clarify
Sure.
your
Sure,
second sentence there.
Sorry about that. There's many
No worries.
non-Git folks at the organization, and their current approach to managing a close to 100-page catalog of projects at the institution are to basically elicit email responses for individual submissions once a year and manage updates manually via emails. So these are, a lot of them are not familiar with Git, or at least if they are, it's purely for software. They're not used to a pull request based approach to documentation. And it seems like an extra, their first response is that this sounds like extra layers of bureaucracy to go through when I could just edit the Word doc. And so the main problem right now is that I can't expect people to have local Git. So, as you mentioned, my first intuition is to let them use the GitHub or GitLab in this case interface to do pull requests. Any hard points in that process? Like anything that didn't work the way that maybe a non-technical user thought it would when they were learning to use the GitHub interface for doing PRs?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would suggest is in terms of like teaching people about Git, the organization, the Carpentries, has really good lessons on Git. So some of those lessons may not be relevant if you're using like GitLab or GitHub's web interface, but I think giving people a general understanding of the structure of branches, of what a pull request means, things like forking, whichever concepts you think are going to be important for that workflow. I think that's a really good starting point. In terms of, so like you said, like using GitHub or GitLab's like web interfaces is, really much better than expecting people to have local Git repos and, use command line Git potentially.
Right.
So yeah, having those web IDs is definitely really, really key. In terms of issues that we've run into, I think, one of the drawbacks of using the web version is if people want to edit multiple pages at a time, it ends up being like one pull request for per page, depending on how the documentation is structured. But it really depends on the structure. So sometimes that can, I guess, add a little bit of a headache for people if they're like, well, I just want to change like these 10 pages. At that case, maybe it's a point where you can have a conversation with them about doing a local setup if they are invested. Sometimes, we might run into issues where if they have a fork in their GitHub repo, if it's not up to date with the original, sometimes that can cause issues. But I find GitHub's like the way that we've done it, where you can click edit this page like directly from our documentation site, takes them into the like most up-to-date version of that page. So I think just thinking about that workflow, making sure they're always using the most recent version, I think is really helpful too.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great advice with the for adopting that with the edit. So to follow up, I guess you mentioned going from this PDF to all of these individual Markdown documents. So similarly, I'm going to be using something like a giant Word doc and trying to essentially manually split it into Markdown documents. Any tips for that? My experience with this is running documentation sites, so like Pandoc flavored Markdown, where you can manage metadata at the header and this kind of thing. Is that something that's successful? Have you any tips on that kind of a process for splitting up the existing knowledge?
So we've actually been recently looking at tools that can help us for converting documents into Markdown. So one thing that I found recently, there are some Google Docs plugins if you're using Google Docs. There's one called Docs2MD, which what it does is you use it and then it converts your document into Markdown formatting. So, if your document has the right structure, it has the proper headings and things like that, it converts it into Markdown for you. So far, I've noticed it works really well. So I would look at tools like that to make that initial conversion process less painful.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to get into some of the questions that we came up with beforehand, and I really encourage folks to participate in the chat. Maybe if you want to chat out loud, we do have some time for participation with everyone towards the end, but I'd love to hear Kaitlin's answers on these questions. So, considering the field of documentation as a whole, what gives you the most satisfaction and what brings you the most frustration or hesitation? Full disclosure, this was an interview question that I went through to get my job, and so, but not about documentation. But it's just a great question.
So I think something that I have found kind of frustrating in previous positions that I've been in as well is the way that documentation work can be prioritized in some places. So I think in a lot of cases it's been pushed to the back burner. It's like, oh, I'll get to it eventually. So you end up having documentation online that's hasn't been updated in 3 years or something like that. And oftentimes can actually cause, user issues too. It's like, well, this documentation is very out of date. So I think that's been a frustration for myself, is seeing how documentation tends to get pushed to the back burner when really it should be prioritized. And in many workplaces, there should be like a person, at least one person, but ideally more than one person whose job it is to focus on that and make sure that it's done in a productive way, and also to engage the organization fully in the practices of documentation. In terms of things that give me the most satisfaction, I would say I was really excited when I found the Write the Docs community. I was just completely like dorking out about it because I didn't know this community existed. And it was really exciting to see people who were kind of thinking through some of these issues, like making your documentation accessible, making sure it has good user experiences, you know, making sure your language is being inclusive. So so there was just like, yeah, that was really exciting to see that group.
Awesome. So how do you set priorities when documenting the processes and policies that you work with?
Yeah, so with the PKP group, like we have our monthly meetings where we try to set our priorities for documentation, but you know, admittedly, like a lot of members of the group are like, sure, let's work on whatever. I don't really have a strong preference. But you know, priorities might surface to the top when there's a big software upgrade coming up. So you know, we have a new upgrade coming up very soon, actually. So that's kind of ends up shifting our priorities towards that new upgrade. PKP really recently released some new software, so again, that you know shifted the priorities for us to focus on that, to make sure that there was existing documentation for that tool as people were starting to learn to use it.
And you've touched on some of the tools that you've used already, and as well as some of the community strategies you've implemented. But are there any other strategies or tools that make your documentation initiatives easier, either to plan or to execute, that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention too is that so we've also tried to form more connections between the development of the software that PKP is doing and our documentation initiatives. So something that we've been doing, I don't know, 6 months or longer now is that we have right now it's mostly one developer, but we're trying to get more developers to do it where they're tagging us directly like in their pull requests. So if they're making changes to the software, you know, in the process of a pull request to PKP software, they would flag it for myself and Amanda. They would say, Kaitlin and Amanda, this change is going to impact documentation and it's going to be released in this version. So that helps us keep track of changes that are upcoming, and it's not so much of a big surprise. It's like, oh, we're releasing this new version and here are all the changes that you have to make. So it helps us really plan things out more effectively.
That's awesome. And now, my last question for you is, over your personal and professional lifetimes, what changes have you noticed in the ways documentation is accessed and provided?
Yeah, I struggled thinking about this question a little bit. I think, you know, there's obviously the changes in like the print manuals that you would have versus like things all shifting into online. Just thinking about my personal use of documentation. Um, I think too, like the shift to like, you know, support forums and things like that versus just saying, oh, read the documentation, you know, trying to have like more of an engagement in that way. Yeah, I struggled a little bit with this question, I think.
Okay. Yeah, as I just put in the chat, I remember I'm gonna say this was 1991. I went to visit my cousins, played King's Quest V for the first time, but they had misplaced the manual, which is what you needed to get past the copy protection that would hit you at any point during the game. And what you said about the change to support forums, and I'm thinking like tutorials occasionally come in the form of code snippets that, you know, just start from here, change some variables, and then you're done. I'm like, but what if I don't really understand what if this is my first time, say, using JavaScript to create a map? Exactly what I was thinking. But and also the rise of like third-party super SEO'd forums like Stack Exchange and clones. But let's open this up to everyone in the chat. maybe if you want to raise your hand or just speak up.
I had one.
Yay, hey Ross.
Hey there, hey everyone. That was great, Kaitlin. I wanted to ask around knowledge management, around documentation. I don't know if I've got the language or if this really, it feels like a problem. I don't know if it is really a problem. Do you have any tips for like organizing documentation logically and structuring it logically so that it's clear as possible for folks to sort of navigate through it intuitively?
Yeah, that's actually a project that we have recently been starting to look at. So because our documentation group has been so active, like we're finding like, oh my gosh, we have so much documentation now. It's kind of starting to get a little unwieldy. So PKP has a UX person who's actually going to do some user experience testing with our documentation site to look at, how people approach it, if things are findable, and in the places where they expect it to be. So I think from like a software development perspective, it's like treating your documentation like you would your other software and thinking about the user experience of it by doing usability assessment or card sorting exercises, things like that. So yeah, it definitely is a challenge, and it is something that we've been recently looking at.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Rachel Bayless from CU Boulder. So I just wanted to say that that is a real problem for us as well, as I'm sure it is for everyone. But I keep, whenever I have a problem, I go to, I want to go to barnesandnoble.com, but their search engine isn't as good as Amazon. So I unwillingly go to Amazon and I try to find the manual, the answer to that. And I have been trying to find a book that has, the 20 steps to intuitive navigation. So if anyone comes across that book, 20 Steps to Intuitive Navigation, I would love to see it.
Thank you. Just going to leave the floor open. I have a lot to say, but you've heard enough from me. I'm also just going to pop the questions that we had for Kaitlin in the chat.
Another thing that came to mind too, Jordan, and I wrote it in the chat as well as I was thinking about your third question, was the shift towards video documentation, which I have very mixed feelings about, but it is a very real shift that is happening. So it was something I wanted to bring up because it's been interesting, that move away from the written manual into other formats, some of which work, and I think some that don't always work well.
I also love when you're trying to figure out how to fix something in your house, the explosion of amusingly illustrated WikiHow articles and the how to fix this thing in 5 simple steps, which is a 15-minute video. And you're trying to figure out where you actually have to get. But Lauren, sorry, I noticed your question in the chat on exactly this. Would you like to come on and ask it?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I was kind of silent in the beginning. I'm also new. This is my first meeting. I'm so happy to be here. I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at the University of Virginia. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, I thought, Kaitlin, it was a great talk, and you brought up a really nice point about video docs. So I work with students a lot, new instruction, bringing new on people constantly around techniques, say for like web archiving or maybe technical concepts that are unfamiliar to get students on board. And I've gotten a lot of feedback, it would be helpful to both have written manuals, but also GIFs, videos, documentation. I've used different tools like Loom to do little snippets of videos for instructional things. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. But my question is about, for folks who are more experienced or focused on documentation, I do it as part of my day-to-day, but I'd love, commentary or feedback on best practices around things like accessibility, if you're thinking about this shift, or structure. So I'll leave it there, but I'd love to hear folks' opinions and thoughts and experience on that.
So I think you touched on this too. I think the key really is to making sure that you have it available in more than one format. So, if you're going to use a GIF, I think there are, best practices for accessibility of GIFs, making sure that they, only go at a certain speed, for example. But, if you're going to use a GIF, making sure, you have that alternate text, because it is similar to using an image where you need to have that description. So I think as long as you have multiple formats, I think that's really what's key there. Or if you're doing a video, then making sure you have transcripts as well.
So Angela just posted it in the chat, something that is new to me. Angela, would you like to speak up on this?
Sure. I'm not sure how good the sound is though.
Oh, you're just fine.
Okay, great. Sorry. Well, I cannot remember what the platform is called that Google has now, but it is actively seeking to recruit or take advantage of GitHub's acquisition by Microsoft. So people are migrating away from GitHub as a sort of corporate surveillance technology. And going to a platform, I'll try to look it up. Which seems to be ironic since it's Google, right? And it was a little alarming to me. I was working in this, and I'll find my the code for it. But so working in this platform and working on this sort of thinking about like, will Google actually now acquire all of the information and what about preservation issues, right? So I brought this up as well. And so, GitHub, what does the preservation policies look like in institutions, not just GitHub itself, which I know has a project. So yeah, and then I was thinking that, in information infrastructures, Google is really a good, is sort of I think this is what you're asking. So how has that been looked at yet? So academic institutions now incorporating the suite of Google products, and then we have to use them for email, for all like documents, for spreadsheets and so forth, all the information. And now it's incorporating these the Google repo platform as well. So that seems a little bit it seems interesting field of inquiry. And then of course the what I was thinking about, which is the documentation. How does that standardize and discipline knowledge? So we're talking about how we can create searchable, easily discoverable information, but is there a body of literature that's looking at that from the perspective of what does that mean to actually do that? And I'll look up the name of the platform real quick.
Thanks, Angela. Thurston's wondering if distributed/decentralized Git hosting is possible for organizations to collaborate on. And here I want to remind folks that GitHub does not necessarily mean open. GitHub is banned in, blocked. Researchers at my institution most commonly work with other researchers in Iran, where you can't access GitHub. So just putting your data and code into GitHub does not make it open necessarily if there are geographic restrictions in place. And we also have an instance of GitLab at my institution as well. Anyone else want to pop in? Ooh, Kelsey, Gitee, can you tell us about that?
So I don't have a lot of personal experience with Gitee, but it is basically a GitHub type thing that you can self-host, making it a lot more under your control and under your organization's control, and a lot closer to decentralized. And the more important aspect of that from the decentralization aspect is like, I guess, I don't know that they currently work well with existing decentralization like data platforms, but I would expect that the developers would be open to it. Like it's that kind of community.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelsey, and say hello to your cat. All right, well, we've got just under 10 minutes to go. But if anyone would like to talk about manuals, oh, Bitbucket. Did anyone else lose the manual to one of their beloved games as a child and not know how to play it anymore? Or I remember playing, I guess it was the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, and it was the first time that I actually had to refer to the manual to figure out how to get through a mini game that I don't believe the tutorial, the in-game tutorial, ever showed me how to do. So if you've played Oblivion, you remember when you have to talk to people and sometimes they're angry and sometimes they're happy and you have to come up with the best response to them. That was something that was only documented in the manual, and I thought, this is the first time I've actually had to pull out the manual for a video game in 20 years. But I see Jeffrey has pasted a question in the chat. Thoughts on policies around documentation first, then implement? I want to see if Ross has some thoughts on this.
I've never done it, but I've loved the idea. I remember, what was it called? Like development by README, I think was another like way of describing this. And you write all of the, the documentation first and then the development comes out of it. I think it would be awesome. But like, I mean, Kaitlin probably feels, I think Caitlin's already described this like quite profoundly. It somehow documentation just always gets put behind it. I don't know why it does. I don't know why.
I'm really happy that my manager saw Kaitlin give a talk at a conference last year on exactly this topic and came home and was like, we're going to do documentation sprints. And then COVID happened, but we're talking about that again. Yeah, dev by README. It's yeah, that's a challenge. And why wouldn't you write what it should do and how it should work before you make it? Kelsey says. That's perfect. And as someone who's very much not a developer and hasn't really worked in too many development environments and went from an environment that was run on like super proprietary software to an environment where we're very much an open source shop. But I wonder if there are, and I guess this is documentation by README is, I guess, how one translates particular stories and scenarios through. Yeah, no, sorry, this is just blowing my mind to something that I'm only just learning about right now.
Well, and this is Rachel again, and when I listen to you guys talk about this, I mean, it just brings to mind, like, back in the day in the American school system, all the kids were taught that they had to use a very formal way of, designing their papers, and you had to have an outline, and it had little Roman numerals, and, you got points off if you didn't outline the entire paper. And yet a lot of people, I mean, I always wrote the outline after I wrote the paper, so it's a thought process. I mean, it's how, it's how people's brains work, and also what they're culturally introduced to at what point in sort of their learning development process, I guess.
And Angela,
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to jump in because I'm actually doing this at the moment, writing software starting. And I started with the documentation as a forcing function to make me think about the user experience from a variety of different users. Because, there's always an infinite number of ways to architect things. So I think it was really good to force me to make those decisions first so that everything fell in a place where it would ultimately be usable and understandable and simple.
Thanks, Alfred. So we're coming to the close of our hour today, but there is some really enthusiastic conversation going on here and links to many resources in the chat. But if you've felt some synergy in the room today, I would encourage you to continue the conversation. If you're not already on the information maintainers listserv, we can get you on there. I know a lot of you have come here from the maintainers listserv, but please contribute, post on the list. Let us know how your various initiatives are going. Thank you so much to Kaitlin for being our special guest today, and thanks to all of you for showing up and participating, especially those who are here for the first time. On the maintainers website, you can browse to the information maintainers community, and there is a link to sign up for our listserv there. But thanks, Al, for coming. Thank you, Kaitlin. So great to see all of you. Take care, everyone.